My name is Alan Luxembourg. I'm president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. I'd like to begin by thanking our host, the National Liberty Museum, and our trustee, Gwen Borowski, and Stanley Ginsberg, the sponsor of this lecture series. Thank you, Stan. This is the last of our series for the year. This is the 20th annual Templeton Lecture on Religion and World Affairs. It's hard to believe that 20 years have gone by since the late Dr. John Templeton started this lecture. And we've had quite a few phenomenal speakers during the course of these 20 years. Among them, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi of the British Commonwealth, speaking about the dignity of difference. George Weigel on Pope Paul II and the dynamics of world history. Robert George, more recently, speaking on the status of international religious freedom. Eric Nelson, a young professor at Harvard, speaking on the religious origins of religious tolerance. And then some of our own scholars at FPRI, the late Harvey Sickerman, speaking on the sacred and the profane, Judaism and international relations. James Kurth on religion and globalization, and Abdullah Schleifer, our Egypt-based scholar, speaking about mass media and change within Islam. Today, we turn to an old FPRI hand, Adam Garfinkle, who began his career at the University of Pennsylvania, where he received his Ph.D., and at FPRI when he was a student. He served with FPRI for many years. He's now back with us on a kind of a part-time basis as a Robert Fox Fellow of the Foreign Policy Institute. But in the meantime, he's held many very significant positions, among them speechwriter for Secretary of State Colin Powell, editor of the National Interest magazine, staff member for the U.S. Commission on National Security 21st Century. He has taught at the University of Pennsylvania, at Johns Hopkins, and he's now editor of the American Interest magazine. Being a nonprofit, we take credit for all of Adam's accomplishments. And being Giving Tuesday, you might just want to remember that as well. The Templeton Lecture was established to ruminate on an issue where few political scientists and scholars of religion could engage usefully. Political scientists tended to be weak on religious phenomena, and religion scholars tended to be weak on phenomena of international relations. So it has always been taken a difficult search to find just the right speaker to address this topic, and I think we have the right speaker to address this topic on the 20th anniversary of this lecture. And the topic for today is how we misunderstand the sources of religious violence. Please welcome Adam Garfinkle.
Thank you, Alan. It's wonderful to be back at an FPRI program. It's also very much an honor for me to be part of the Templeton Lecture Series. I mean, some of the people that Alan mentioned who have preceded me are quite impressive folks. And I wished I could have been present in all previous 19 lectures to hear all the wonderful lectures. So the 20th year turns out to be unlucky for you. That's the way it goes. I'm certainly no Jonathan Sacks. I'm certainly no Robbie George. But I'll do the best I can with the subject that I've thought about and read about and ruminated about for a long time. I could go into more grace notes. That's how you're supposed to start a speech. One learns that kind of thing writing speeches for secretaries of state. But frankly, I don't have time for more grace notes. I have a lot that I want to get conveyed to you. And frankly, since all these lectures that I do for FPRI are kind of one-offs, you know, I do one lecture on that subject and then I never do it again, I never have any idea how long it's going to take to say what I want to say. So it either ends up being, approaching possible brilliance, or it ends up being a train wreck. I never really know. And I don't know right now. So we'll just see what happens. We just, lay out the throttle, get the engine going, and we'll just see where it takes us. The subject, the sources, let's forget about the misunderstanding part. That kind of goes without saying. But the sources of religious violence, it's a very daunting subject. It's complex, it is capacious, and of course it's highly charged emotionally. I probably have only time to scratch the surface on some of these things, but let's just go and let's start with, at the risk of seeming a little bit pedantic, let's start with definitions so that we can make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. That would be nice. So religious violence. A lot of people, when they think about religious violence, they think about Islam. They think about Islamist, not Islamic, but Islamist religious violence. That's the flavor of recent decades. And there's a tendency to conflate the two, to conflate religious violence with terrorism. Actually, no, that's a mistake. So by way of definition, it's nice to have a good idea of what terrorism is and what it isn't, and what religious violence is and what it isn't. So what is terrorism? Let's just be very brief and telegraphic. There is actually a definition of terrorism. And the basic definition, which is accepted by the State Department and the United Nations both, for what that's worth, is that it's violence perpetrated against innocent civilians for purposes of terrorizing a polity or a community. And as David Fromkin explained in a brilliant Foreign Affairs article in 1975, which is like ancient history, the purpose of the terrorism is instrumental. It's to get the government that is the target of the terrorism to overreact and to be untrue to its own principles. It gives lots of examples of that, and I won't go into them now. But the point is, terrorism is an attack, a random attack against innocent civilians for purposes of shocking, terrorizing, catalyzing counterproductive behavior in the target. So we have over the years gotten kind of excessively expansive in how we've thrown around the word terrorism, so that, for example, it's very common to refer to the attack on the USS Cole as an act of terrorism. It was common to refer to the attack on the Marines in October 1983 outside of the airport in Lebanon as an act of terrorism. But that's not terrorism. Attacking uniformed soldiers on foreign soil is not terrorism, okay? And when you expand and you conflate what it means from our side, it gives free rein to those who like to argue that, well, you know, there's no real definition of terrorism. There's no such thing as terrorism. One man's ceiling is another man's floor. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, and so on. And that's just not true. There actually is a definition of terrorism, and if we don't stick to it, then the bad guys don't have to either, which is a bad thing. Religious violence is something totally different. Now, right now there is religious violence in the Middle East, South Asia, Southeast Asia, that is sectarian in character. It's Muslim against Muslim. It's Shia against Sunni, largely, or it's Alawi against Sunni in the Syrian case, and so on. Now that's violence, and it's arguably, although it's not so clear, based on religious motivation, but it's not terrorism. It's just violence. Okay, so it's very important to make sure that you understand the difference between terrorism and religious violence. They're not the same thing. Okay. Now, another problem. I mean, actually, the problem that we have to parry before we can get any further. What do we mean by religious violence? What do we mean by that? There's kind of an assumption built into the topic that the kind of violence we see, whether it's terrorism directed outside the region, terrorism in the region, or sectarian violence in the region, the whole potpourri of nasty, bloody things that go on, that it's all really basically about religion, and it's about one religion in particular. It's about Islam, whether it's in its Sunni form or whether it's in its Shia form. There are other forms, but let's just keep it simple. And that's a problematical assumption for reasons I'll get into more later. When you actually ask about what are the sources of political violence, all this violence is political one way, not all of it has to be religious. So what do we mean by religious anyway? People are rarely aware of all of the sources of their own behavior, even when they're not doing anything violent. But certainly when they are, when the adrenaline is pumping and a person is about to do something, violent and nasty and bloody, people are not in the thrall of it. They're not always aware of the reasons why they're doing what they're doing. There are lots of other explanations for why people do what they do, whether it's acts of suicide, homicide, terrorism by one person, or whether it's groups of people acting as a terrorist cell, like when Al-Shabaab goes into Kenya and murders people at a hotel in Nairobi and things like that. What about ethno-nationalism? Terrorism, when it first came onto the international scene in the early 1970s, thanks to courtesy of the Palestinians, that wasn't the kind of terrorism we're talking about now. That wasn't religiously articulated mass casualty kinds of terrorism. That was instrumental terrorism that was wedded to a nationalist movement. And that's where many of the methodologies that are still being used by Al-Qaeda and ISIS came from. Although actually, truth be told, some of the modalities, for example, like the suicide, the explosive vest, that wasn't invented by any Muslim. That was invented by the Tamil Tigers in the context of the Sri Lankan Civil War. So there you go, right? So not all of the violence is religious. There may be other sources. If you actually look at the academic literature on what motivates people to do violent things, the literature is now fairly vast. I mean, I counted like 35 books on my shelf that tried to get at the subject one way or another, all right? And of course, the subject existed before 9/11. There was terrorism before 9/11 of a different sort, but even then, many academics tried to figure out just what exactly motivated people as part of a thought exercise to figure out what you might do to alleviate it or stop it. Perfectly practical kind of endeavor. And just about every kind of academic discipline has been involved in this, in trying to think through what makes a terrorist, what motivates a terrorist. So psychologists have been involved, psychiatrists have been involved, sociologists have been involved, economists, behavioral economists, political scientists, area studies people, and we'll get around to it in a minute, cultural anthropologists, and even a couple of brave historians willing to go beyond their historical data and lean it into the future. A few brave ones, not very many are brave, but some are. People from all different disciplines have gone about this, and again, there's shelves full of books. And what you end up with, if you actually read this stuff, I haven't read all of it, but I've read enough of it, I think, to get the basic idea. What you end up with is a kind of layering of motivations. Some are psychological, and indeed, some are solipsistic in the sense that the focus of the research is on the individual mind, what goes on in the mind of a single person. Okay, and this is not completely worthless because there are such phenomena as lone wolf kinds of attacks, but the vast majority of the research points to a different kind of variance. The basic argument of the best literature, and here I'm talking about Mark Sageman, Scott Atran, and for Europe, Olivier Ra and others, the basic understanding here that social scientists have of this is that religious ideas, however they're expressed, or wherever they come from, have to be socially embedded in order to motivate behavior. What does it mean to say that an idea is socially embedded? It means that the idea exists in I guess you'd call it a Socratic exchange among people in a community. So that, it's very difficult to tease apart a motive that sounds religious because the articulation by the individuals involved or the individuals who sent, say, suicide terrorists on a mission, they use religious language to describe what they have done or they are going to do and so forth. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's religious in its motivation. Again, it can be an ethno-national motivation. It can be essentially a tribal motivation. If you notice, if you actually look closely into those little cells and groups that fight in Syria or that fight in Iraq or that are involved in sectarian violence, religious violence, so-called religious violence, so-called sectarian violence, or even that use terrorist methods, and almost all of these groups under duress will use terrorist methods, assassination, bombings, innocents will be harmed, bombing markets and things like that. You often find that there are clots of people who are related to one another. Okay, they're either brothers or they're cousins. They are embedded in the tribal structures, in the extended family structures. When I use the word tribal, I'm using it as a social anthropologist uses it, not in a pejorative way. I'm just describing a social structure, okay, that matters in most parts, not of the Middle East, though differently in different places. So Scott Atran, who's a French analyst, I don't know why his first name is Scott if he's French, I've never figured out, but that's not important. He talks about the devoted actor. He has a thesis of the devoted actor. So basically it has to do with peer pressure. It has to do with people who are often marginalized in their families and communities, people who are looking for a way to prove themselves, show their bravery. There are several other kinds of psychological motivations, but they only come into play, they're only armed, so to speak, and operationalized to conduct violent operations when they are embedded in a group. Okay. Now they may get support or authorization or legitimation from an alim in a mosque, They may. But that doesn't entirely explain what they do or why they do it. So again, the articulation of the reasons for it may sound religious. They may even quote Quran or Hadith or something like that, but you can't assume that just because the articulation has religious tonalities that the actual motives are religious. It seems to me, actually, that if somebody says, I am doing this for a religious reason, and if that person actually believes it, regardless of the subconscious motivations that might be actually at work here, then I think it's reasonable to say that's an example of religious violence. If a person says it is and actually believes what he says, okay, I don't think you can get much more fine than that. Then that qualifies as religious violence. Again, whether it takes place in a terroristic mode or whether it takes place in a sectarian context with some Muslims fighting against other Muslims, it doesn't make any difference. If a person says it is and believes it is, then it is. In other words, if you remember Kathy McConnell from Kids Corner, if you ever listen to XPN's Kids Corner, there's this wonderful little line, if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck and there's duck poop on your pickup truck, you can bet your bottom buck it ain't no armadillo. Same thing. If he says it is and believes it is, then it is. It's religious violence. Okay. The problem with the other assumptions, they kind of like troll along with this, the title of the talk, really, is that there's nothing specifically Islamic, and there's nothing specifically. Even if you're talking about religious violence, there's nothing specifically Islamic about the kinds of dynamics that lead people to behave violently, at least not historically. All right. I mean, the flavor du jour of violence seems to be mainly Islamic, and there are reasons for that, which I'll go into in a minute. But historically, lots of religious organizations, ecclesiastical organizations, have engaged in violence. So there's nothing especially Islamic about it. But I think it is fair to say that the scripture and the learning that goes along with the scripture, the interpretation of scripture over many years, and the context within a religious civilization is founded and develops, places more or less constraints on the exercise of violence in the name of God than other religious traditions. So if take the three main Abrahamic traditions: Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. At different times in history, all three have engaged in violence for explicitly, avowedly religious purposes. So there's something about the Abrahamic family of religions that, although it places constraints, obviously, on the exercise of violence in God's name, those limits are not absolute. On the other hand, it's kind of hard to imagine, frankly, a bunch of Baha'is, say, going out and drawing blood in the name of their religious beliefs. So there's a range. Not all religions are created equal with respect to the kinds of constraints they put on their adherents about the possible uses of violence. But it's context specific. So for example, the Baha'is never controlled a state. They're not armed. The idea that religions are dangerous and that religions cause wars, the kind of cocktail hour bullcrap that you hear sometimes, this is only true under two conditions. One, if the religion is evangelical. In other words, if it thinks that that the message and the messenger have to be the same, all right? And if they're armed. If one or both of those conditions are not present, then the religion is not particularly dangerous as far as issues of war and peace are concerned. But again, every basic religious tradition has its own sort of parameters, its own allowance for in extremis, under extreme conditions, when violence might or might seem justified to adherents. This even goes for Buddhism. Nowadays in the United States, we like to think of Buddhists as a pretty bunch of peaceful, laid-back kind of guys. Historically, that wasn't always the case. It certainly hasn't been the case in Tibet in history. And I'll come to another couple of examples where Buddhists can be pretty nasty guys when they really feel like they have to be. They can use plenty of violence when they feel like they have to. So again, I think in the case of Islam, because Islam was born in essentially a military operation, Muhammad gathers together, creates a unity of organization out of the tribes of the Arabian Peninsula, And the development of the theology and the development of the polity that's associated with the theology is all associated with a military conquest. And the Quran reflects that synthesis, that concrescence of religion and polity and military. The figure of the Ghazi, the warrior in Islam, is a very esteemed position, you know. It's right up there with the Caliph and with, you know, all the other heroic roles that one plays within the civilization, within Dar al-Islam. So a lot of people would argue, therefore, that Islam is more prone to, to violence, and they point to the concept of jihad, of holy struggle. But of course, if you say that to a Muslim, the Muslim will say, since the 7th century, since all this stuff got started, the word jihad has meant lots and lots of different things. In Ahmadiyya Islam, it means an inner struggle to overcome adversity and to overcome the temptation to sin. So it's been deracinated from the historical narrative and turned into something quite else. And anyone who's a Christian or anyone who's a Jew in the room would recognize that process in their own faith communities, because that happens all the time. And it's a good thing, by the way, that it happens. It happens all the time. So people argue about this. Personally, I don't. If you look at the history of Islam, yeah, there have been lots of violent episodes, but there are lots of violent episodes in Christian history too, and there are lots of violent episodes in pre-2nd century Jewish history. So, what exactly does that prove? Probably not a lot. Why does this matter? Well, I'll get to that in a minute in more detail. But we had after 9/11 we had this very strange argument. Strange because it's possible for three or four or five different positions to be taken trying to explain an issue, and for all of them to be wrong. It actually happens. It happened. So, for example, after 9/11 happened, liberals, basically typically said, they're thinking Cold War. That's the metaphor. That's the reservoir of historical experience they were able to draw on. Maybe 50 years worth. That's about it. Well, the reason why these terrible things happen, the reason why these people are so pissed at us, and the reason why they've attacked us, it really has to do with a lack of social justice, poverty in their part of the world. They're resentful. They're alienated. They're just taking it out on us. And really, what the Middle East needs is a Marshall Plan. I wish I had a nickel for every time I heard a liberal say that the Middle East needs a Marshall Plan, and that would solve the problem of terrorism and political violence religious violence emanating out of the region. Well, people who said that didn't have much of an idea what the Marshall Plan was to start with and why it worked. Crazy idea. But meanwhile, conservatives, a lot of Republicans said, no, it's not about poverty or injustice or anything like that. The real problem is the lack of democracy, the freedom deficit. And all we have to do is democratize 22, 24 countries, who's counting, in a couple of generations, and voila, the problem will go away. Because the real problem is that these people are frustrated and pent up. They can't express themselves. They're repressed by authoritarian political cultures. So if we could just democratize them, take our American bag of tricks over there and just presto changeo, introduce an independent judiciary and a free press, boom, you got 24 democracies. We'll start with Iraq. What an idea. And that was their explanation for what was wrong with the region. Neither one of these explanations was even remotely close to understanding what had happened. And I'll get a little bit into this later about what actually was the explanation, what really did happen. But now we have a guy in the White House, I won't mention any names, who actually believes, as I just said, that and he said this. I mean, whether he believes what he says, I have no idea. He actually says that Islam itself is the problem. Islam is not a religion of peace, as George Bush tried to palliate after 9/11 in order to tamp down his fear of Islamophobia in the United States. Actually, as far as the president-elect is concerned, the problem isn't a lack of freedom, it isn't injustice, it isn't poverty. It's that Islam is inherently violent and terroristic. That's what he said. So this is another way to be wrong about the subject. We'll see what the consequences are starting, I guess, in the middle of January. Now, there's also another aspect to why some religions seem to be greater barriers to the exercise of violence among their constituents than others, and it has to do with fatalism. Before the Abrahamic Revolution, I think it's fair to say, and this is what the intellectual historians and the people who know this stuff argue, people basically conceived the universe as cyclical, just like the seasons. They were inured into nature. So it was fall, and then it was winter, and then it was spring, and then it was summer, and then it all happened all over again. And human beings were The real action were among the gods, the spirits, and they were above the dome of heaven. And human beings were kind of minuets, they were puppets, not minuets, marionettes, thank you. Yeah, it's my nap time. Puppets, and the real action, so that really people didn't have a choice over what happened to them. It was pretty much fatalism, it was all predestined. And Abraham comes along, and the Abrahamic Revolution says, no, There's a teleology of progress. Human beings are responsible for their own behaviors, and human beings individually and collectively actually create their own futures. We are free to do that. There's a tremendous responsibility that comes with that. So human life is not cyclical, it is progressive. It reaches out into a future that we are free to affect, for good or for not so good, depending on our own behavior. And here are the rules of a moral life among individuals and within a community. And if we act this way, we can create a better future. And if we don't, then it's on us if we don't. That was a revolutionary idea 5,000 and some years ago. To a lot of cultures, it remains a revolutionary idea. There's still a lot of places in the world, there are cultures in the world that don't believe that are still locked in fatalism, locked in the cyclical notion of causality. And the more fatalistic I think a religious culture or a political culture tends to be, I think the more likely it is to lack restraints against the exercise of violence. I can't prove that, it's just a kind of a logical inference that I make, but I toss it out to you for your own delectation. Now, what really did happen? What was 9/11 really about? It seems to me that once you sort of carve away all of the explanations for politically violent behavior, if you believe the social scientists, and probably 90% of it, I'm just making up that number, but it's an intuition, and about 90% of it is explained without any need to reference religion, From the psychological, the sociological, the importance of embedded contexts for articulated rationales or pretexts for violent activity, about 90% of it probably is taken care of. What are the questions that social scientists tend to ask in order to, basically remove 90% of the variance before you even come to the question of religion? I'll come back to the question of religion, trust me. Well, these are the questions that they typically ask. There are four that I think are the most relevant. The first one is, under what socioeconomic conditions do people tend to join terrorist groups or tend to engage in religious violence? Under what socioeconomic conditions? Second question people ask is, does the profile of extremists, and extremists, of course, being the pool of those out of whom violent actors come, is there any kind of self-selection that goes on? Is there any kind of pattern in the nature of their behavior or their position within the social structure that cues recruitment for various terrorist groups, various violent religious groups? All right. The third question is, does ideology matter? In other words, do abstractions, do concepts matter in either the self-motivation or the recruitment of individuals into terrorist groups? And if so, do different or variations of ideology draw people into different groups? Is there any kind of correlation there? And then finally, again on the solipsistic level, is there a mindset or a type of personality in the great swath of human personalities that tend to be susceptible to extremist propaganda and to extremist beliefs? Those are the four questions that get asked most often. And even though I'm sure that a lot of social scientists who devote themselves to this on a regular basis would be horrified with the kind of summation that I'm about to give you, I'm just going to answer the questions for you, just in a nutshell. So the first one, yeah, you're darn right, socioeconomic conditions have a whole lot to do with circumstances, and I think it's pretty obvious what they are. When times are unstuck, when people are fearful of the future, when they cannot predict what's going to happen to them, when certain verities and certainties of their lives are ripped out from underneath of their feet, as happens, for example, in civil wars and in upheavals of various kinds, then yeah, people will reach deep down into their creedal guts and come up with any kind of rationale to try to respond to a very anxious situation. And I think we all realize, even from looking at, the voting trends from Brexit and even from our own recent election, that anxiety leads to fear, and fear leads to anger. And anger, if it's harvested and nurtured by the right kind of political entrepreneur, can lead to hatred, and hatred can lead to violence. I mean, this is pretty simple, I think. So obviously, it's in unstuck conditions when there's a tendency to for radical or extremist groups to make hay with their kinds of ways of thinking. In a civil war, there are no moderates, there are no liberals. You're either on one side of the killing field or you're on the other. The people who like to say, well, on the one hand, on the other hand, they don't get very far in a civil war, in a very unsettled, polarized, and highly emotional situation. Tends to polarize out. As to the second question, it seems to me that the answer is that, poorly educated or miseducated people tend to form the pool of recruits for most of these organizations. I mean, you might think, just because some of them in their suicide notes occasionally, though less often than you might suppose, quote Quranic verses or quote a hadith or something, very few of the people who are engaged in terrorism or in political violence more broadly in the Arab world, Middle East, very few of them have madrasa educations. They really don't know a whole lot about Islam. A lot of them are barely literate because the educational systems in many of these countries don't work very well. What happens is you have these, again, you political entrepreneurs, whether they're clergy or not, or someone like Osama bin Laden who issued fatwas, but he wasn't a clergyman. So that's practicing without a license, right? But people do this. And the Islamic tradition is capacious. I mean, the Quran is full of wonderful stuff and interesting stuff, and the hadith even more so, and the seerah literature about the Prophet's life even more so. And it's capacious in the sense that you can grab anything you want out of this literature and just take it out of context and present it to a novice and say that it means this, okay? And that person is liable to believe you. If they want to be part of a group, if they want to feel like they're part of something larger than themselves, if their self-esteem has tanked and they need to somehow find a way to resuscitate it, to rebuild their sense of dignity or honor in the eyes of their older brothers or their cousins or their parents or grandparents or what have you, as happens in extended families and in tribal societies. And here's the other thing you have to understand. Some cultures are just more concrete than others, all right? In the United States, in this kind of an audience, I guess most people have finished high school. I'm guessing that most people have been to college. Probably a lot of people in the room have graduate degrees, right? We're used to abstract language. We're used to conceptual language. We know how to think up in the air, all right? We can detach the way we use our brains from very concrete kinds of daily quotidian operations. Not every culture is built the same that way. There are people in Morocco, there are people in Algeria, in Tunisia, in Saudi Arabia, not so much in the Emirates, in Egypt for sure, in Pakistan, people whose educational background has not inured them to the practice of abstract or conceptual thinking. When they confront a political entrepreneur using Islam as a way to recruit for a particular purpose, it may be the first abstract or conceptual language they've ever heard. And it can be pretty enticing. It has an air, relatively speaking to what they're used to, it has an air of sophistication about it, okay? It makes their hair stand up on the back of their neck. It opens their eyes. If you're not used to conceptual or abstract language and you're dealt it by somebody who is sincere and sophisticated, and you're in a room where 15 people are in the room and all the other 14 people, they're all going, yeah, that's right, that's right. That's pretty heavy stuff if you don't have your own educational ballast to think critically about what you're hearing. I think that's a major part of, again, the embedded social context of religious violence, religious thinking. And then, there are some people, but the third question, there's some people who argue that styles of thinking are important. Some scholars, I forget their names right now, they're not important anyway. Knowing their names isn't important. There's a new book out called Engineers of Jihad. And their argument is, they noticed that there's an unusually high incidence of engineers, people with engineering training, education, who end up being terrorists or leaders of violent religious, like Muhammad Atta. Remember in Hamburg? He was an engineer from an Egyptian school, right? There are a lot of engineers. Why is that? Well, different people have noticed this, and there's some theories. You don't find in left-wing radicalism, including in the Arab world, but you don't find a lot of engineers, right? You find a lot of language majors, and you find a lot of art history. You don't find a lot of engineers. What is there about engineering? Well, the argument that these authors make is that let's take Egypt, or take any sort of society that is a swirl. Let's put it that way, where kind of taken for granted stabilities are not so easy to take for granted, right? Where life is kind of chaotic, where institutions and attitudes don't match the way they're supposed to, the way they do in a modern Weberian state. Okay, there's a lot of swirl, a lot of disorganization, a lot of randomness, a lot of chaos. People feel a little nervous when they're in a situation like that. You never know, when the police are going to come and shake you down and threaten to beat the crap out of you if you don't give them things like that happen in Egypt all the time, or they used to under the Mubarak period and before. Probably they still do. So you go to engineering school, and do you really learn to become an engineer by European or American standards in Egypt or Syria? Sometimes you do, but not really, not usually. The education usually doesn't quite get you there. But what are you exposed to? You're exposed to mathematics, and you're exposed to scientific and engineering principles and concepts. In other words, you're exposed to basic science, even just Newtonian, let alone Einsteinian, right? You're exposed to some structured knowledge. And what is the character of that structured knowledge, right? It's invariant, it doesn't change, it works under whatever conditions, it's apodictable, in other words, and it's hierarchical. It's true and it's hierarchical. It's a beautiful system. It has mathematical cadence, and it's sonorous. It's logically sonorous, all right? People who are attracted to that kind of thinking, get in engineering school, want then to systematize the rest of their thinking. So they run into, a radical Islamist idea, and this is highly systematic thinking. It's conceptual thinking, like I said, abstract. It's highly systematic. It's syllogistic. A and B and then C, and so that's the way it's presented. If the prophet said this, and if the prophet said that, then that means this. And if you actually look carefully through the jurisprudential way that Islamic thinking works, it's very simple, similar to rabbinic thinking. In fact, there's not much real difference. The logical beauty of it is really surpassing. I mean, it's just enveloping. It takes you in. It's so wonderful, right? So somebody who has no control really over their environment, who's introduced to the kind of thinking that comes along with math and engineering, then wants to apply that rigor and that hierarchical crispness to other things that matter to that person, religion and so forth. Well, there are the Islamists right there. So yes, there's a style of thinking I think that also contributes. Now, last question. Are there certain kinds of personalities that are inclined toward extremism? And so I think the answer is obviously yes. Many, many years ago, I think back in the 1960s, one of the first books written about this very subject was by a guy named Milton Rokich, who wrote a book called The Open and Closed Mind. It's a famous book if you're a psychologist or a psychiatrist. It's one of the first books that actually, really seriously systematically examine this question. There's no question that some people are simply more attracted to the simplicity of ideas than others. Some people just can't wrap their mind around non-zero-sum situations. Some people are sort of natural Manichaeans, natural social Darwinists, natural either-or type people. They're chocolate vanilla people. They can't imagine strawberry or cherry, all right? That's the way some people are. And yes, the kind of authoritarian didactic character of the Islamist discourse appeals to those kind of people. It's open and shut, no ambiguities, no loose ends. There are people like that. And those are the kind, so on all four of those questions, if you go down, again, back to the point, you go down the list, okay, you find that between the psychologists and the psychiatrists and the sociologists and the economists and all that, basically 90% of all this gets explained without a reference to religion. You don't need religion to explain this stuff. Actually, the tribal social structure of most of these countries, most social scientists would argue, is more important than any religious element in it. Is this true? Yeah, I don't know. But I'll warn you about one thing. Western social scientists, most of them, are not themselves religious people. So there's a tendency to discount how seriously other people take religion. It requires an almost encyclopedic ignorance of one's own history to do this, because what were Christians in Europe doing about 450 to 500 years ago? They were fighting a sectarian religious war, and they took it very seriously. Trust me, they took it very seriously. Meanwhile, there was a Muslim superpower called the Ottoman Empire, right? Not a fanatical religious group of folks at all, looking upon the Europeans' sectarian religious war and saying, how can I parry this? How can I exploit this? Talk about a switcheroo, huh? Talk about the shoe being on the other foot. You wait long enough, you see almost everything, you know. So 500 years later, we'll see, you know, we'll all be here together. We'll gather again in 500 years. We'll see where things are then. Anyway, so it seems to me that religion actually does play an important role in the violence we're seeing in two different ways, two very different ways. I got to check my clock. How am I doing? I'm doing great. Am I doing great? Okay. Yeah. Do I hear 30? No, just sold. Okay. There is something very, very fundamental to how pre-modern people feel about sin. Basically, let's just use that quaint word, sin. In the Muslim world, in traditional Jewish culture too, in lots of other places, a mother will sit down with a young boy, in particular a boy, and say, these are the things that you must not do. And I don't want to have you had dinner? I don't want to ruin your appetites or anything, but you must not touch a woman that you are not related to. You must not engage in premarital sexual behavior. You must not masturbate. You must not do this. You must not look at salacious pictures. You must not let your mind wander in the way of impure thoughts. And again, these religiously authenticated or legitimated rules, okay, are socially embedded. All mothers tell their young sons this stuff. So what happens? Along comes movies and Western entertainment stuff, and then the internet, for God's sake, and the electronic sewer that carries every possible form of pornography all over the planet. And you have Muslims living in the United States, where they're in Florida, for God's sake, where they're exposed to any number of salacious. And so what happens? So the young boy, let's say now he's in his teens or in his 20s. Okay, he lapses. What does he do? He hires a hooker. He watches dirty movies. What it doesn't make any difference. He feels guilty. He feels a physical stain, a stain. This is how traditional societies characterize these things. It's a stain, like a drop of blood in a vat of milk. Okay? So what does the person do if they're a typical traditional, strung out between two cultures kind of guy? Well, they're sorry. They go to the mosque. They try to repent. They promise they won't do it again. But they do it again because the temptation is simply irresistible in certain contexts. In big cities, in Florida, wherever, they do it again. And so they repent again. And then they do it again, and so on. So what happens? After a while, a person can feel as though they are completely lost. And they can never fight their way back. They can never atone their way back. Martyrdom is a way to end the torture of always feeling guilty. It is a way to redeem themselves in the eyes of their family, their parents, and that is the way you get rid of the stain. Now, this is not necessarily Islamic. This is pre-Islamic. This is pre-Abrahamic. Why did Greeks sacrifice human beings on top of mountains? They were trying to propitiate the deity, or the deities, all right? But this idea that you feel shame, you feel stained, physically stained, and you must remove the stain, and if you can't do it, then your life is forfeit, basically, I think is part of the motivation for a lot of lone wolf, and not just lone wolf, suicide bombers and terrorists that populate the Islamic world. Because the level of temptation has simply become irresistible. You can't put a shell around people these days and guard them from all of this salacious stuff that's everywhere. Now, of course, the elders blame the West for this. We're the ones, the West, we're the ones who've sent all this sewer juice toward them. They're pretty upset about it. They're not entirely wrong about it, all right? So that's one way that religion plays in. But it's not religion the way you think of it in terms of in terms of texts and scriptures. This is a deeper strata of what one can mean by religion that can motivate people. The other one, and I'll try to end here. What really happened after, what was 9/11 really about? 9/11 was really about Chiliastic religious violence, pre-millenarian, end-of-the-world religious violence. That's what it was, all right? Anybody who knows any history to speak of, right, should have seen this right away. Now, of course, the political class in the United States, and I don't know about, not all of them, but a lot of them, their reservoir of historical metaphors to draw on goes back about 50 years. Some of them may go back a little farther. But basically, the default drive of all Americans in thinking about anything, whether it's Western or not Western, is the Cold War. Because that's how people were reared. That's their seminal experience, current generation. So as I said, after 9/11, oh, it's poverty and it's baloney. Or it's a freedom deficit. So we need a forward strategy for baloney. What it was these Middle Eastern cultures have come under tremendous stress from the West. They cannot cope with it. They are failing as polities. Some of them are breaking apart before our very eyes. Iraq, we helped Iraq. Syria, Yemen, Libya, we helped Libya to break apart. These societies aren't working. Again, the correspondence between institutions and attitudes just is not there. They're at sea. They're failing. And especially, a lot of people in this part of the world feel not only betrayed by their own autocratic and rapacious governments, but they feel tremendous pressure, especially in a globalized era, from the West. And they feel that their corporate identity is at stake. It's existential for them, all right? And so when societies are under pressure like this, it's the Middle Eastern countries today, but I'll go into some other examples from before. The society tends to break into three parts. There are the accommodationists. There are those who say, look, they're stronger than we are, they're wealthier than we are, why don't we just do what they do? And you've seen, since really the beginning of the Western intrusion into the Middle East, which we can date with the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt in 1798-99, you've had a whole group of people who are saying, well, they're stronger, they're wealthier, let's be like them. Let's Westernize. Then in the middle, the second group basically says, well, we don't want to lose our culture. We don't want to lose our corporate identity. We still want to be Arabs, or we still want to be Egyptians. We still want to be who we are. So we'll take the technical and the scientific stuff, but we won't take the cultural baggage that comes with it, okay? So, for example, we'll take the machines and so forth, but we won't take the idea of Christmas, or we won't take their holidays, we won't take their calendar, whatever. That kind of like split the difference. But then there are always a group of nativists or radicals, or what do you want to call them, rejectionists, who say, no, we can't take the machines and not take the rest. Life doesn't work that way. And we dare not destroy ourselves, who we are, by throwing in our lot with these aggressive, look down their noses, condescending Westerners who think we're a bunch of wogs and swarthy, subhumans. No, we must mobilize our traditions. And we must fight back, okay? That's what's happening in just about every country in the Muslim world today. It's what's happening in every one of them pretty much. This shattering into these three basic views of how to respond to the pressures, especially in a globalized era, from the West, what to do. Al-Qaeda and ISIS are clearly examples of the third school. They are the ones who say, no compromise. And we're going to mobilize the people to our side by the use of religious symbols. It's really political what they're doing, or social, but they're using religion in order to mobilize people. And they're using religion, cherry-picked to justify the use of violence against the far enemy, the United States and the West, and then the near enemy, the regimes they hate, and to set up the caliphate and to purify. That's what it is, okay? That's what it is. The West is a prop in this civil struggle among Muslim countries. Just a prop. The real action is inside the countries, okay? And when you say, when someone, if God forbid, someone says from the White House, from the Oval Office, Islam is the problem, Islam is violent, what does that do? That plays right into the hands of the worst actors in the region. A lot of people in the region are conspiracy theory minded. They already believe, because they've been told, and they don't know any better, that the West is trying to destroy Islam. The West is at war against Islam. If somebody then says from the Oval Office, yeah, okay, we're at war against Islam, that really doesn't really help the situation, it seems to me. In any event, this is, again, there's nothing specifically Islamic about any of this. There's nothing Arab about any of this. Let me just tick off a couple of examples, all right, from history. In the 2nd century, some of you may be aware that there was a group called the Zealots, Jewish Zealots, fighting the Roman Empire. This was an example of chiliastic religious violence. These people were just nuts. They thought that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. Even Rabbi Akiva thought that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. And at one point in the struggle against the Romans, this group of zealots actually destroyed the food stocks in Jerusalem that the government of Jerusalem had accumulated in order to withstand a siege. They actually burned down the warehouses where the food was. Why did they do that? To force everyone to confront mano a mano the Romans. That did not end well. It really did not end well. Not only was the temple destroyed in the year 70, but in the year 135, everything was destroyed and the exile took place. That didn't really turn out so hot, okay? Let's move along. 1099 now. It's 1099. We're moving along 800 some years. The Crusaders conquered Jerusalem. This is millenarian. This is where the word chiliastic comes from. It's a Christian word, right? They thought that in the next year, in 1100, the second coming would happen. They were just sort of entranced by the calendar and by round numbers. So the idea was you liberate Jerusalem, you kill as many Muslims and Jews as you possibly can, you bring the Messiah, that was chiliastic. You should read descriptions. If you've never read descriptions of what the Crusaders did in Jerusalem in 1099. It'll curdle your blood, what they did, all the people they killed. And again, in a religious rapture they did it, believing that it was all for the sake of bringing the second coming. Let's move along again. Let's move along to the 14th century or so. The White Lotus movement against the Qing dynasty in Manchuria in China. Another strange religious cult, end-of-the-world religious cult, believed that they had a very, very interesting sort of syncretic eschatology of what would happen at the end of the world. And a lot of times chiliastic end-of-the-world kind of thinking becomes very quietist and inward. But every once in a while it projects itself outward in suicidal violence. And the suicide is a cleansing. The suicide is necessary to prepare the way for the day of doom, for the day of judgment. All of these cults and all of these circumstances have a day of doom, day of judgment kind of element in them. And so it totally removes the constraints on killing innocent people. Because all the good people are going to go to heaven anyway, or they're going to be in the afterlife, or something like that is going to happen. And so you're not really hurting these people. You're just ending history, which is a good thing, so that it can prepare the way for God's kingdom. Then we have another couple of examples. I just want to very quickly go through them, just so you get the idea. Thomas Müntzer and the Peasants' Revolt, 16th century Germany, probably the archetypal example of chiliastic religious violence. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Thomas Müntzer or the Peasants' Rebellion in just post-Protestant Reformation Germany, but if you could just Google it and just read what happened. Again, rivers of blood, ecstatic, murderous behavior, lasted for years. Hundreds of thousands of people died. Then there is the Taiping Rebellion, 19th century China. This lasted a long time. 20 million people, that's the estimate of people who died. This was a strange syncretic religious cult. It was some Chinese guy who believed that he was Jesus or Jesus' brother or something, and he managed to turn half the Chinese empire against the dynasty. And again, it was a huge bloodbath. Why do you think the Chinese are so excited about, so annoyed, so frightened by something like the Falun Gong, which we think of as kind of comical, right? Well, they know their own history, and to them, this stuff isn't comical. It starts small, but it doesn't necessarily stay that way. Now let's come closer to modern times, okay? We have the Mau Maus in Kenya. Some of you remember that from the 1950s and 60s. Same thing. Kenyan society split down in three ways. The nativists went back to animist religious traditions, and they tried to mobilize Kenyan society against the British, and they pretty much succeeded. So the Mau Maus are kind of a small-scale example of premillenarian chiliastic religious violence. But the example that I love best, really, and the example that you might have thought that American statesmen would have noticed, happened right here in North America. What are called the ghost dances of American Indians, the Paiute and the Lakota people, okay? There was a prophet. His name was Jack Wilson. That was his anglicized name. His Indian name was Wavova, something like that. It was quite an interesting almost all of these there are always charismatic figures involved. Munzer, Jack Wilson. What did he tell the federal government broke a treaty, ripped apart a huge reservation in what is today South and North Dakota to give to Eastern settlers. The Indians were a little irritated, you think? So this guy said, no, don't kill white men, don't steal, don't lie, don't cheat, live a clean, honest life, and do this dance, and we must unite the Indian tribes. We must not hold enmity toward one another. Again, sound like Muhammad with the tribes of Arabia? Maybe a little bit. This ascetic lifestyle line, the mysticism, actually in Lakota language, it's not ghost dances, it's spirit dances. It sounds a little better, right? So this ended at Wounded Knee in 1890 in a bad way, those of you who know your history. But this was a textbook, out of central casting example of chiliastic religious violence. Otherworldly, premillenarian, mystical religious activity. The Indians didn't turn it violent, we did. The white people turned it violent, but same basic idea. So you would think that some Americans, our political class, would know their own history well enough to recognize a similar phenomenon to what Al-Qaeda was up to on our own soil, less than 100 years earlier. No. No. Anyway, so there are religious aspects to the violence in the Middle East, but I don't think but I think they matter only in these two very specific kinds of ways. Certainly the broad brush notion that all the violence we see is religiously motivated, is so believed in, is so stated, there's nothing else is going on, I think is a dramatic and misleading oversimplification of what is happening. And if you understand the problems that are down deep in the societies, and you understand the problem of actually moving decisively to a new state of affairs in these countries, whether because of internal reasons or external circumstances, and you look at the violence that's continuing to go on in many countries in the region, Syria being the most dramatic example, but there are others, it's not easy to see when this will end, This, it seems to me, is going to be a convulsion that will last generations in the Middle East. And there's a very limited amount that outsiders, including the United States, can do about it, even if we wanted to. We can cordon it off, we can limit it, we can try to sanitize it. There are things we can do, but solve it we can't do. Barack Obama couldn't solve it, Donald Trump won't be able to solve it. It's something we're going to have to manage and live with for a long time. There are aspects of religion involved in it, but it's not fundamentally a religious phenomenon, except, again, in these very specific ways that I've tried to describe. I'm out of time, aren't I? Okay, then I can't give you my round. I'll do it later. So thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you. Thanks for that very upbeat, optimistic conclusion. I would add a footnote to what Adam said about the Marshall Plan for the Middle East, because while you were talking, I Googled Marshall Plan for the Middle East. And just this year, General John Allen, General Michael Flynn, Senator Lindsey Graham, and Vladimir Putin have all called for a Marshall Plan for the Middle East. Anyway, we'll open it up for questions. We have a few minutes for questions. Nelson Wolf.
I divide the world into three groups.
Yeah.
Sheep, wolves, and sheepdogs. And I like to think of myself as a sheepdog. the Nazis, if you need a movement, you need an ideology, you need a group of people, and you need peer pressure on that group. There's a way of looking at the soldier and why they fight and why the group fights, and it may be for two different reasons.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, many of the groups you spoke about historically who passed through this were defeated militarily. They were wiped out, including the Tamil Tigers, by the way. My question to you, as a sheepdog, what do I do?
Well, it's a good question. There are certainly times when trying to reason with other people under the convulsions of religious extremism, you're not going to get very far. I'm glad you asked the question. So yeah, sometimes you just have to kill people. Okay, that doesn't really solve the problem because the source of the let's put it this way: it ameliorates the problem temporarily, and that's good work if you can get it a lot of the time, right? But it doesn't solve the problem because it'll just come back. The sources are still there, and a new generation will come back. Not forever. I mean, particularly the anarchists around the turn of the previous century, they were a scourge for quite a while. Assassinated President Garfield and the Italian Prime Minister and so on and so on. But eventually it died out. There's something about chiliastic or suicidal groups that doesn't conduce to long-term stability. They kill themselves and they're gone. So we don't always just have to kill them. They kill each other, kill themselves. Look what's going on in Mosul right now. That's disgusting. I don't want to get into it, but I'm glad you mentioned the issue of ideology. It's been a long time now since people have realized that theology and ideology, or religion and ideology, have a lot in common. They're both creedal systems. They're both highly abstract systems, but they're not the same. There are differences, and here is the key. There are a lot of differences, but here's the key difference. A theology, which is, by the way, theologies are about God. Religions are about men. Don't mix that up either. But theologies are essentially non-falsifiable belief systems. A religion can never be proved wrong because it always punts its ecstasy into a distant future. Right? Not so with ideology. Ideologies are tethered more tightly to reality, to seeable reality. So that, for example, take communism as an ideology. Its historical arc lasted about 100 years, roughly. But it failed by its own lights. So there is a reality check for political ideologies that doesn't exist for transcendent religions. So they're not the same, right? And this is important because in the Middle East, people still see things, not everybody. I mean, generalizations are always perilous. As a rule, the cultures of the countries of the Middle East see things through a religious prism, not an ideological prism. As Bernard Lewis once said, in the West we think of countries that have religions, but in the Middle East they think of religions that have countries. It's still basically accurate. Things have changed, but still basically accurate. So when George Bush declares, first of all, use the word crusade, I think, without even knowing the etymology of the word. That was unfortunate. When he talks about a forward strategy for freedom or democracy, how does that come across to Muslims, to traditional pious Muslims? It comes across as a version of Christianity. And becoming a Democrat or adopting these kinds of ways of doing politics is essentially an act of heresy. And Abu Musa al-Zarqawi in Iraq back in the day made that very explicit. There were posters basically making that point. And, not everybody believed him, but a lot of people, that works in that part of the world, right? So now, we, on the other hand, are a post-religious, we think we are a post-religious society. Actually, in the West, we still have very, very deep creedal systems, only we think of them as a kind of secularism. We hide from ourselves the creedal anchors of our beliefs. They're still faith-based. They're not really anchored in science, a lot of our political and ideological beliefs, but we call it ideology. And in the West, ideology has an autonomous existence as an intellectual or scholarly pursuit, right? In the Muslim world, it really doesn't. Politics and public space is a subset of religious law. It's a subset of concerns about other kinds of subjects, right? It doesn't have its own autonomous sort of discourse, right? So now think about what this means. There are actually people right now, not right now, it's a little late, but there are people on the 5th floor of the State Department in a new counterterrorism messaging center. And what do these people do? I'm caricaturing a little bit, but only a little bit. What do? They sit down and they think to themselves, okay, if we can just find the perfect set of words, put into the perfect order, sentence after sentence, paragraph after paragraph, not too long, and we can create the perfect translation of these arguments against radicalism and extremism, the perfect translation into Arabic and into Farsi and into Urdu and into Pashto. And if we can manage somehow to get it in front of would-be perpetrators of violence, terrorists, and so forth, they'll read these words and they'll go, oh, I've been wrong all this time. Thank you for pointing it. See, this is what I call the rationalist fallacy. What motivates these people is not some sort of cold-blooded abstract thinking about theology or religion. It's highly emotional. It's highly socially embedded. It's highly group dynamic, right? There are no sets of words we could ever come up with that would serve that function. This is a waste of time. So when you get right down to it, if these guys are coming at you with suicide vests and stuff, you have no choice but to just kill them. You have no choice. So I'm not against that. I'm just saying, it's not the final answer to the problem. The problem is going to be with us for a long time. It's going to kill so many people,
I think we have a husband and wife team here, Rochelle Wolf.
Okay, growing up in the Cold War, I don't know if it shortened the war by our ability to say things like dirty commie, but we were taught to say things like that, and now we've got the opposite. So when you talk about religion, you didn't really talk about our understanding of religion, and I don't understand why there is such silence, as though you can't criticize a religion in the same way that I wouldn't make fun of some aspect of Christianity. I can't say anything about Islam, even Islamic terrorism.
Yeah. Well, it's a good question. There's a lot of political correctness in the country, as I think we all know, and I think the election results clearly represent a reaction against the more extreme forms of political correctness. But being able to say, accusatory things about Islam doesn't make them true. It may make the person who says them feel better, but it doesn't make them true. Let me just rehearse very briefly a subsidiary point that is closely related to your question. A lot of conservatives have claimed, they've argued in recent years that, the Obama administration talks about violent extremism. It never uses the word Islam. And a lot of people say that's a total cop-out. Why don't we just call the enemy the enemy? Why don't we call it what it is? All right? It's a great applause line. But you will notice, I think, that if you look at not just the 8 years of the Obama administration, but the 8 years before that of the Bush administration, the rhetoric doesn't sound much different. Bush administration didn't use that kind of language anyway. Why? Two reasons. And the reasons shifted over time. The balance shifted over time. The first reason, directly after 9/11, was the fact that the president was wise enough to not want to incite anti-Muslim violence. He went a little overboard with the Islam as a religion of peace stuff, all right? But that was his motive. I mean, that was what the White House got together and they said, we have to make sure that we don't make this worse, okay? That we don't live the prophecy of our enemies, all right? But the other reason is, I think, more delicate and more interesting. There are a lot of people in the Muslim world, in the Arab world, who see things more or less our ways. They're not with the terrorists, and they're not with the rejectionists and the nativists. Okay, and we have a nuance when we speak in English. We distinguish Islamist from Islamic. Islamic just means something that has to do with Islam. But the adjectival form, Islamist, means militant, radical, violent, okay. Guess what? When you try to retranslate that nuance back into Arabic, you can't do it. It doesn't work. Maybe it could be made to work, but it doesn't, it's, for the man on the street, right, that distinction doesn't work. So what happens when, if American officials, or European officials, start railing about Islamists, but it comes across in the region as Muslims, just regular, pious, traditional Muslims. What happens then? Our friends in the region Arab friends and other friends of theirs saying, if you do that, if you talk like that, you're going to screw us, okay? You're going to make it look like it'll be hard for us to be friends with you because you are attacking, in the minds of the street, all Muslims, not just radical Muslims. And again, the gradations of who was a radical and who was this and who was a Wahhabi and who was a Salafi, and so it's not black and white. There's a lot of gray area. There's tremendous room for misunderstanding. So if you go to Dubai or you go to a place where you can relatively say anything you want, and talk to Arabs there, as I have, or go, to Egypt and talk to people, they plead with you. Don't call these jerkwads Islamic. Don't label them Islamic. It makes our life impossible here, all right? And if you think that through, it actually makes a lot of sense. That's why both the Republican administration after 9/11 and the Democratic administration reached the same conclusion. So again, it's a great applause line for conservatives to say, let's call them who they are. It's a stupid thing to do. Just from a pragmatic point of view, it's just stupid.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're out of time. Well, that was a very important lesson at the very end there, that what we say and what other people hear may be two completely different things. Definitely. It was a profound dissection of the sources of violence, religious and otherwise. I thank Adam for joining us tonight, and I thank all of you for joining us.
Thank you.